Hello, good afternoon. It seems like ages since I've done one of these. I have been so busy. So apologies that you haven't seen me for a while, but I'm back speaking to Jon this afternoon about all things guitar, sleeper, Bob Dylan, book writing. Who knows? We'll talk about that in a second. But first, it's a man and his laptop.
I need to get going, Mel. See you later.
Oh, the sights of London there in the background of that video. Not too far from where you are, Jon.
Yes, Brighton, sort of South London, really. South London and a bit.
And a bit.
Yeah, about 55 miles, maybe. I don't know.
And a lot of minutes, depending upon what time of day it is and what's happening with the traffic.
Yes.
Yeah. No, I used to travel that road a lot from London down into Brighton, and in fact, I have a fascinating story to tell, and I'm going to tell it very quickly just for you. It's the worst accident I've ever had is on that M23.
Oh wow, yeah, it can get a bit as you get further south. The old version of the road was a bit dodgy.
Well, let me tell you what happened, because this is an odd one. I was actually hit. It was a lovely sunny day, and it's nice actually, that road, when it's a nice sunny day. It was a clear road for once. So the last thing on my mind was that I was going to have an accident that day. There was nothing in front of me, nothing behind me. All of a sudden, the car blew up.
Wow!
Right?
Wow!
When I came to, Jon, I'd found out from the policeman that had come up to the window, I had been hit by a wheel, not a tyre, but a wheel that had come off a car travelling on the opposite carriageway.
Wow, gosh. Wow, that's scary.
Scary,
that kind of random thing can happen when you're just innocently driving around on a beautiful day. Yeah.
So I just like everyone to know that that sort of thing doesn't normally happen in and around Gatwick Airport, but it did to me.
You never know.
But you never know. So life's too short is the thing that I took away from that. And so you got to get on, and you got to make things happen. But now, we normally ask people on this program where music started for them. But you're a writer as much as anything else. You've written about your journey, etc. So without going over old ground, tell us where did the urge to start making music come from for you?
I'm just a fan. I'm just a fan who lucked into a couple of good bands, basically. And my job is just to try and not mess it up. Got very lucky to work with some very talented people, and my main gig is just to try and not screw it up for them. My dad had vinyl, as happens when you grow up in the 70s and 80s, and he had Django Reinhardt album, hot jazz album from interwar France, and he was a massive Stephen Grappelli fan, and he was a bit of a violinist himself, although kind of retired. And he had the Beatles collection that came out in the 70s, the blue and red best of.
Oh.
And that's what I grew up on. I grew up on Stephen Grappelli and the best of the Beatles tracks. And then we also had all the stuff I could afford to buy as a kid was all the sort of crap vinyl, like the Live in Hamburg, all the stuff that's now deleted, Live at the Hollywood Bowl, that they've since deleted and didn't include on any of the anthology collection. So I used to listen to those a lot. And I had a neighbour, unironically called Mary Wilson. She was a massive John Lennon fan, and she wasn't very well, so I used to go and visit her and spend a lot of time in her house listening to her vinyl. And she had all the John Lennon's solo stuff. She was very kind of right on sort of hippie lady, I suppose, older hippie lady in a way. And And yeah, so that's where the love for that came from. And then my first job was working in the Sheffield had a civil service office called Manpower Services Commission, which was a big old sort of attempt to spread government out to the regions. And I got
I remember the logo for that, the little black
that's
outline
right.
man.
So that head office was in Sheffield, and I got a summer job working there. And my boss was this amazing old guy who just sort of chain smoked and had 6,000 blues albums at home. So he bought me a cassette called 100 Minutes of the Blues, which I've since lost and then repurchased on Amazon or maybe eBay, because that's such great stuff on. And just to turn me on to blues music, he bought me this sort of gift, gave me this cassette really. So then I've been in my first loves are I guess sort of Django Reinhardt, Stephen Capelli, and Beatles and Lennon and old blues, which is kind of what led me into folk music and Bob Dylan as well. But I'm very kind of traditionalist like that. I mean, I like 60s music really, and after that, I'm not that arsed. I grew up as a punk kid. I had older friends at school who were really into punk in 77, summer 77, 78. They lived on the end of my road, and I was there. I would have been 12 at that point, or 13, can't remember. And they, or maybe 11 anyway. I was their sort of mascot that summer, and they sort of hung around Sheffield with this sort of kid that was too young for punk, but really loved it. So that was my other birth into music. And he had a great punk collection, Buzzcocks and Pistols albums, and loads of really obscure punk. So like the early Buzzcocks stuff, like Spiral Scratch and things like that. And then off the back of him, I got into Kraftwerk. So that's my sort of 60s stuff, and then sort of creative post-punk. My favorite album was the Devo, the first Devo album. Oh, we're not having a Devo. That, and one of the interesting things about that is produced by Brian Eno, and you could play that to students today and tell them it was recorded a couple of years ago, and they won't know. It's so well recorded. And Devo were their early stuff's really not that well recorded, but when they got in with Brian Eno, he just really made them sound amazing. So yeah, that's my sort of early stuff really. That kind of
is Brian Eno someone you've kind of followed the career of? Because for me, he's an interesting character. I think in particularly because he's not only made music and produced music, but he's also kind of dissected what the music business is about.
Yeah,
like he's got this, this kind of he had this diagram of like the six kind of the six kind of models of the music business. I
wrote a book chapter on Brian Eno. Hang on for a second, I'll go and get a copy of it.
There you go. So live stuff like this just doesn't happen anywhere else on the internet, right? Where we mention a book and that, mention a topic and there's a book about it.
I'm an academic and I work at BIM University in Brighton, and so I've been sort of publishing bits on. I wrote a piece on Robert Johnson, one of my earlier sort of peer-reviewed journal pieces, and
I've got to ask you if you've written on Robert Johnson, what you made of the film Crossroads.
Oh yeah, I loved all that stuff. I mean, some of the there's a couple of documentaries from the period that one was really good. In Search of Robert Johnson, I thought was excellent, and it was made by the son of the guy who found the original vinyl and made those records. The old A&R guy, John Hammond. His son made this amazing documentary in Search of Robert Johnson. But that's the Brian Eno book, Oblique Music. It's a collection of academic essays on Eno. And I interviewed Devo about working with him, and they didn't go on very well, as is often the case when a really good producer shapes up what what a really alternative sounding band want to sound like. I mean, the same thing happened with the Lars, I think, when they made that record with Steve Lillywhite. But yeah, it was really interesting to hear from their side what it was like to work with Brian Eno. And he was recording them for free. Bowie was helping to pay for it, I think. Bowie saw them in a little punk club in New York and said, "I'm going to make you famous. You're amazing." And they offered to produce their album, and then ended up Eno ended up doing it. So there's a chapter in Brian Eno Bleak Music called Eno versus Devo.
Eno versus Devo. That's brilliant.
And about how they kind of work together or not.
Or not.
I got to interview Jerry Casale, who's a fascinating guy who's very radical. He was radicalized as a student because he was at the Kent State shooting when a bunch of Vietnam War protesters were trying to protest against the Vietnam War and fired upon by American National Guard. And that's what radically he tells that experience very vividly. And then they got to go and work in a tiny studio in Germany with Eno, Kraftwerk studio, actually, the same Connie Plank studio in outside of Dusseldorf in the freezing cold February, and had all these disagreements about what should go on there. And that first Eno album's got this amazing. I sort of tried to come up with a phrase that would then become a meme in academic world. I call it like an analog underscore. It's got all the way through it. It's got this sort of weird analog Moog synth noises going off from that they put on there, and Mark Mothersbaugh put them on, who's one of the real creative parts of that band. It's just a non-stop stream of sort of synthy dribblings.
Yeah,
and so it was really interesting relationship to unpick. A little bit like the Dylan Lennon one. So obviously, the book is about Bob Dylan and John Lennon. I'm always interested in
relationships
between artists. Yeah, the Eno Devo one is Jerry Casale was really interesting to talk to about it. It's a very, very vivid memories, even 40 years later. And it's such an incredible. Are We Not Men? It's such an incredible sounding album. Eno really made them sound brilliant. And, so
sometimes tension works, doesn't it?
Yeah, exactly. It's creative tension in the studio, and what transpired at the end was really, really. I mean, often it doesn't, but when those people work, what came out at the end, I think, was a groundbreaking album that sounds like virtually no other. And
I'm reading David Byrne's book, How Music Works, which you've probably read. And that there's chapters in that about how he works with Eno, and fascinating. How he said, well, Eno would send me over songs that he thought might be songs, but they're not songs, and and they're struggling to be songs, and the kind of David's approach, which is quite different in a way. He then kind of not seeing the challenge of that. Like some people would have seen that as a real challenge. Where's the song here? But he was just like, no, I'm just going straight for what I always do, which is I'm going to put a melody out, and then I'm going to work it, almost reverse engineer this into a song, and they suddenly became songs.
But Byrne's an outstanding artist. I mean, when I was a kid with my sort of older punk friends, I got turned on to that, to use a hippie phrase, and Talking Head stuff really early. And some of those sort of pre-fame. I mean, they were well known in the indie world, but sort of the big hits. Some of that stuff, super Life During Wartime and things, just incredible releases. And I guess the interesting thing in his book for me is that he writes about music and space really well. So why music works in big spaces is fascinating. And how stadium music works. I've got another chapter in a book on stadium rock, actually, funnily enough. I'm not just plugging book chapters here, but I did a chapter on
plug away. It's
stadium. I can't find a copy, but I had a hard copy of it kicking on here. It's the arena concept. And I interviewed a bunch of people. It's another academic book, and I interviewed a bunch of people about what it's like to play in arenas, and this was just at the time when in-ear monitoring was coming in, so that was kind of interesting. Some various, and obviously sort of talked about my own experiences.
Oh God, do you know what? I wish I'd grown up with in-ear monitoring.
Yeah, I know. So do I. Well, they have to be careful because it can get really loud really quickly, and it can be louder than regular stage monitors. I know a few people who've damaged their hearing through one of them actually through accidents with in-ears. Yeah, getting it accidentally touching the volume pack, turning it up really loud halfway through a song, and not feeling you can turn it down to the end. I've had that happen a couple of times. In fact, I don't use in-ears anymore on stage. I've gone back to monitors with earplugs. Yeah. But,
there's a really great chapter. We'll talk about books for a minute. There's a really good chapter in the diaries of Steve Hogarth, the singer with Marillion, where he talks about in-ears, and talks about singers taking out their in-ears for that moment. You know, where you know there's a point where you just need to take it out and live within that moment where you're hearing the whole space.
Yeah. And the massive disadvantage of in-ears is you can't do, like, the mix doesn't change wherever you stand on the stage. And what I love about monitors and just regular earplugs to dampen the sound is that you can walk around. So if I want to hear more drums, I just take 2 steps towards the drummer. If I want to hear more of me, I'll just take 2 steps towards the amp. And if I want to hear more of the singer, I'll just stand over the monitor speaker. And that's how music used to be made when they recorded it. They'd be like, "Oh, Louis Armstrong trumpet's really loud. You need to go and stand at the back of the room, and this double bass is really quiet. So I'll put you closer to the microphone." Even when guitar amps came in, you know, tracks, loads of those great '60s tracks, were made with the band in a room with mics moved to or from the speaker cone. Nothing was close mics. It was all a few inches away or more, depending on how much room spill they purposefully wanted. And then
that's actually the chapter of the David Byrne book that I found the most fascinating, was the bit where he talks about like Edison and the beginning of technology.
Yes.
And it's like, you know, you literally kind of lined your musicians up in order of loudness away from the horn.
And Armstrong was the reason why Louis Armstrong is probably the most important musician of the 20th century was he's the first rock god, because the trumpet was the loudest instrument, so he would always be at the back. But there's an interesting thing about the Edison thing with the piece I did on Robert Johnson, which is in a online peer-reviewed journal called MC Journal, stands for Media Culture Journal. And it's about whether or not, it's about how we perceive Robert Johnson, because there's been a huge debate in academic circles about whether or not his music was sped up. Because the person who recorded, obviously he's got this sort of high kind of falsetto howl and incredibly articulate fingering right up the neck on a you know, an old school acoustic with fat strings and probably. Well, wouldn't be that loud, that high up the neck for a street
and it's basically, why didn't he sound like John Lee Hooker, right?
Well, he possibly did, and the idea is that those early recording, he did 2 recording sessions in hotel rooms in Texas, and the engineer who did them all was actually a British engineer who was working over there, and he had these discs which were very expensive to record onto, and they only had 2.5 minutes aside, so he would set the record speed slightly slower in case the artist overran. I mean, they'd have to arrange it quite carefully. It's not like Robert Johnson could sing as many verses as he wants as a street musician, but they had to cut the songs down to 2 minutes 30 or however long was on the disc, and then he'd give himself an extra 20 seconds by reducing the speed by 5% on the machine, and which meant that when you play them back, they're naturally fast. They're a whole tone fast. Now, Robert Johnson, if you play it a tone down, sort of 5 to 10% down, it does sound like John Lee Hooker. It sounds like a regular blues player.
Wow.
And Johnson played an open G, right?
Yep.
Which is what most of the blues musicians of the time played. In Spanish, they called it. Well, all his recordings were in open A. So
that doesn't make sense.
So it doesn't unless he had a capo on the second fret of the guitar.
And no one ever saw him with a capo on his guitar.
No, he there is the one picture of him. He's got a capo on the second fret of the guitar. So one of the two. There's actually 3 or 4 pictures. It's
up for debate then.
It's still up for debate, but I think there's loads of stuff on YouTube. If you listen to Robert Johnson slowed down, and it was this guy at work actually in the civil service bought me the Robert Johnson album along with this cassette tape, which is just for a young guy, it's a massive. It's just an incredible experience to hear that for the first time. And as Bob Dylan writes about in his memoir, the first time he heard Robert Johnson, it was like a ghost walking into the room, and felt very much the same, I think, for any musician who hears that. But it transpires we've possibly all this time been listening to him at the wrong speed. So that was a piece I wrote in MC Gen that kind of discusses that. Whether or not it's correct, we'll probably never know, but kind of discusses the debate. I sort of explain the discourse around it and how it's interesting in itself. And the more you look into Robert Johnson, the more of a mystery he becomes. It's our sort of perception of him is kind of fascinating. The more every time we try and find out what happened to him, we find another potential gravesite. So now there's 3, maybe 4 potential grave sites for Robert Johnson, 3 of which have got actual memorial stones on. And every time there's a new bit of research done, it's like, oh no, it turns out he was buried here. No one at the time of the idea that his music was sped up, no one was alive who'd actually heard him. So no one could. There wasn't anybody left that you could go to and go, is this what he sounded like, or does it sound faster to you? Plus, of course, memory is an imperfect thing from 70 years ago. It's always going to be not necessarily verifiable whatever anybody might what I can't remember the guy's name that famously played with him who lived quite a long time afterwards, but so who really knows? But some of the stories around that stuff are fascinating. I did go out to Mississippi to do the sort of blues graveyard tour. I went to 2 of Johnson's graves, and that was the weekend of Hurricane Katrina.
Oh no!
I was the only person on the road. Me and my partner at the time, we were driving in a rental car. Rain. I was like, I'm from England. I know wind and rain. You're all like.
Not like that.
No, I know. It was one of the biggest. Talk about car crashes. We were driving down the road, and the rain was so heavy it just turned into a river, and you could see the tire tracks and in the river of water behind, in the rearview mirror, and then the power lines that they run by the side of the road were all sine waving in the wind, and one broke off, and so I just remember this power line scything across the road in front of us, blue sparks everywhere, as it hit the road.
Like that film Twister, isn't it, with the cow that goes around.
My partner wasn't very pleased at the time, but I got to see a bunch of graves that day, and it was very very atmospheric.
Now I'm just going to take you back to Sleeper hitting the big time and stuff, because I was in a band at that sort of time, and we were sort of touring around the northeast, making a noise. So that you were a band that I was always on my radar. Always enjoyed the music. So what's interesting is when you think about the bands that came out at that time, a lot of the rhetoric from the bands at that time was always about music that was quite close, I suppose, to that time. And yet, actually, most of the musicians I've talked to from that time now that that's all over, will now go, actually, I was really into this from way back there. Whereas at the time, there was something about that time. Do you not think that where people were, their reference points were so, there was almost people were scared to kind of reference stuff further in the past, almost like we are the new breed of this?
Well, I don't know. I think for us, our breakthrough was the tour with Blur, supporting them. We had a number 1 indie single, and they were obviously smashing it with Park Life. And they were sellout venues, and you could just tell like there was a sea change happening in music, and this whole sort of British thing was going to happen. Kurt Cobain had just committed suicide, so there was a new window of opportunity for something, and so you could just tell this whole thing was going to break massively. I mean, I remember Blur doing Shepherd's Bush Empire, which is not a massive London venue, but it was so rammed. They ran a line from the balcony to the stage desk at the back of the stalls because they had some extra PA in the in the balcony at either side of it. Just a little bit of PA stuff for some extra guitar effects. Radiohead were doing the same thing at the same time. So they ran a line from the balcony. The sound desk is right under the balcony. I remember people jumping up and down because we watched Blur every night on that tour because they were just amazed. They were on fire. And people were jumping up and down on the balcony. And I remember the line going slack and then taut and slack and then taut in time with the music.
Well,
thinking, oh my God.
Are you just waiting for it to go?
Well, you kind of felt like it's an old building, but surely it can put up with a few hundred kids jumping up and down on top of it. But then you were also thinking, well, I suspect they've possibly oversold the venue. I mean, we had that with a few sleeper shows on the Smart Tour, which was, we booked quite small venues, and then suddenly we had a top 5 album, and we did a couple where, well, I mean, I remember crowd surfing at the Lead Mill in Sheffield and getting right to the sound desk, turning around and sort of swimming back across the crowd.
But did that help you in a way?
Probably shouldn't be able to get this far crowd surfing even at a sold out venue.
Yeah, but actually selling out little venues like that when things are changing is actually really good for you, isn't it?
Well, it's absolutely what you want. Yeah. And I remember on that tour, I'm from Sheffield originally. My mum and my aunt were at the sound desk, and I sort of crowd surfed across the crowd, got to the sound desk, could see them stood at the back, it's sort of behind the barrier next to the sound engineer. And my mum hadn't been looking for some reason, and my aunt dug her in the ribs and went, "Look at her, Jonathan!" And I was like, just on the ground, like waving at my mum, and then swam back, which you shouldn't be able to do unless a venue's massively oversold. I could, but obviously that's a serious allegation against the Lead Mill, so that's just my impression of it, and it could all be completely misremembered, and I'm sure the Lead Mill have never oversold a gig in their honourable 40 years of existence, and I would hope that they will continue to exist because the venue's now under threat. So that's just an anecdote. It may or may not be true. Yeah. But it was just a time of real energy, and I think the media jumped onto that. But problem younger artists have today is there's no kind of single media source. There's no gatekeeper. There's no kind of umpire to decide what seems what and what's happening where. The media and music's become so fractured by different avenues. I mean, I get most of my music today off of Twitter and YouTube and people sharing ideas and Spotify. And there's more songs being put on Spotify than you can listen to in a lifetime pretty much every day. So there's a real element of oversupply in the market to a certain extent. So
I was going to bring you back to that though, because one of the things you said right near the beginning was, you were talking about an album you can't get anymore, right? And for me, that's one of the reasons why I start to see a re-interest in physical format as well. People wanting to buy something that is potentially different than you'll get on Spotify or any of the digital platforms, but also, as I've gone back and I've kind of gone, I need to get that I listened to back in the 80s or in the 90s again, and you trawl through the digital metropolis and you find, it's not there. You suddenly go, well, I really want that physical thing. I mean, I don't know whether you've ever, if you've been looking, then you do the whole eBay thing or whatever other market platforms are available. But sometimes, some of the prices of things, you think, well, actually, I'm not surprised that that's going up in price because that's the last version of it.
Yeah. And I guess a lot of people put stuff like that up on YouTube as well. So there was a couple of albums that weren't available that I was trying to reach, that, and or they'll put the files up on a file sharing service or something. I suppose it depends whether or not you actually want the hard copy anymore. I'm not that I mean, I'm going to get rid of a bunch of books this year because I've just got too many, and they're all in digital copy on my e-reader anyway. So I don't. I feel the same with albums. I got a box of vinyl down there, but I don't live in a massive place, so I don't know if I can afford the space, and I don't know personally if I'm going to dig a record out when it's actually on my computer hard drive or streamable on YouTube. Anyway,
Yeah.
I think we're a certain generation that's tied to the idea of music in a physical form, and I'm not sure that's going to last forever. Which is a shame, because we've got best of both worlds at the moment. You can get music or a book like that. This is my actual book, Dylan Lennon Marks and Garden. Having this like as a thing just means the world. You can get it digitally, but having this, it's like, oh my god, and it feels a lot like when a record comes out and you get a CD of it or ever, or a vinyl that you've made. It just means you can physically hold it, and I felt that a lot as a fan as well. And
yeah, humans are a tactile. We're humans are tactile, right? And we like to physically hold on to something.
But we live in the best of worlds. You could look stuff up as well. Like you can, you don't have to wait for something to be physically available, shipped to you. You can just, we could mention a book or an album, and somebody can click on Spotify and stream it, or go on a digital retailer such as, for example, Amazon, and just buy the digital copy, and you can be reading it in under a minute, which is incredible, really. So we do have the best of both worlds, but ultimately I think convenience will win out. And if you think about the cut, as an artist, there are some things you're aware of that probably as a consumer you're not, which is that making stuff and shipping it, and particularly vinyl, is a right pain in the arse. Like, vinyl's got to be pressed and put in a box and sent and not broken. I mean, the returns contract on most record contracts is like, used to be 10% or 15% just for breakages. And books too. Like, I've had a bunch of these. I bought a number of these to send as Christmas presents. I'm like, oh no, this one's got it's got a scratch on the top. I'm not going to use this. Is going to be my edit copy for if I ever do a second edition or whatever. But like, oh no, I've signed it and I've bloody creased the page on it. So it's like physical.
Well, if you get any more copies like that, John, you can send one to me. That's fine.
Physical artifacts are they're much more difficult to curate and sell. Like, they've got to be in stock. You've got to print the number that you're going to sell. If you're making a record or a book and you press 2,000 and you only sell 1,000 as a young band today, you've made a loss there. So, but then again, you press 1,000, you sell 1,000. And you've got a huge opportunity cost because you could have sold 3. So the physical production of stuff, whilst it has a glamour as a consumer, and whilst this is like I just love being able to have this as a writer. This is Cambridge University Press. I didn't have to do all this stuff. They did that. If with the Sleeper album, like we've done some reissues, I mean, Louise and Andy take care of most of that, and it drives them up the wall because it's so hard to get it right. Is the pressing good enough? Is there a crease on the box that's like, oh no, it's another one we can't sell or whatever, and suddenly your margins diminish. And as a young band, that can get really tough making that work. So there is something to be said for the digital world of just streaming and downloading and whatnot, but at the same time, having something physical, it is pretty special too. So I can see both sides. I think it's a shame that the physical element will probably eventually go, just because the digital is more convenient.
Well, I think the biggest shame with it isn't actually necessarily the physical aspect of it per se, because and I think it's interesting, again, David Byrne talks about that in his book. He talks about that, how the power exchange changed and how the money exchange changed, because suddenly, you know, recording costs virtually zero, right? Because you can do it in your home, whereas you used to have to record the studio. Distribution costs virtually zero because you can now just upload it. You know, you didn't have to pay you know, so most of those cost elements disappear. I think the biggest disappointment for some artists, and I'll go to I was watching Jules Holland the other week, and it was the album World Album Day, and he was interviewing Paul Heaton and Jackie Abbott about the fact that it was World Album Day, and he was asking what's the importance of an album still to an artist. It'd be interesting to get your take on that, but you know, Paul was saying really it's the fact that it is a snapshot.
Yeah, it's a body of work. It's a collection
of work.
It's a collection of stuff where you're at for that particular. I mean, the album cycle's normally like a year and a half, 2 years. That's where you're at that moment, and it's you know 10 songs that represent that stage of your life, and it has a beginning and a middle and an end, and you decide the track listing, so it's got a narrative arc and a you know. Ideally a nice visual representation of what it stands for, and so it's very different to sort of drip release and songs like people do now, and even when that is done, you know, think about something like Lemonade by Beyonce. That's really a concept album. You could argue pretty much every album's a concept album. Albums aren't really abstract collections of songs. They generally have a theme, even if it's not actually articulated in the way like 2112 or whatever is a famous concept, or Sgt. Pepper's, you know, they've got, or, you know, something even more blatant.
Unless it's a greatest hits collection, and in which case it's
and then it's, yeah, but then the concept behind that album is it's a
greatest hits. Yeah, it's photographs of their career, really. Yeah, that's the concept. But I'm guessing what I'm saying there is, the one disappointment, I suppose, that comes with the digital age is the fact that the listener doesn't buy into that album thing anymore. And I suppose it's one of the reasons why I suppose bands are trying to hold on to, and some of us are trying to hold on to albums, if you like, is just that remembering that the importance of listening to a whole album, you know.
Remember when you were a kid and like old people talked about the music from the war and big band era? That's what albums are like to young people today.
Yeah,
it's an anachronism. I went to see a big band concert when I was like 18 or something. It was amazing. It was like 40 people in a room all playing like, you know, tunes from the war. It was actually pretty good, and or not, you know, similar with an orchestra, but you know, they need government funding largely to continue. So it's that I think we're possibly hanging on to something that isn't going to necessarily survive us. I don't want to give you
rain on anyone's parade.
Yeah.
but
so I try and be a little bit, you know, I'm a hoarder, so I've got to keep whatever I've got physically. I've got to keep to the minimum.
Yeah. But what you're saying is absolutely right. In a way, that whole period where everything was about the album, you know, and especially when you're looking at like the 70s or whatever, where there was all of that excess of money around, you know, albums, and band spent years in the recording studio and millions recording.
But we invest physical things with magical properties, right? So
yeah.
This physical thing exists. It contains the music. I mean, if you're streaming, you haven't got that material object that carries the songs with it. There's an element possibly of evolutionary psychology in that sort of artifact worship, whether it's a record or a CD that's imprinted with this magical stuff that makes you feel nice. And we do that with other objects. There's a famous psychological experiment where they have a ballpoint pen and a jumper, and they tell these postgraduate students that the ballpoint pen was used by Einstein to write his first iteration of E = mc squared, or fountain pen, I guess it would be. And they pass it around, and everyone's like holding it like it's, you know, a relic, the bone of Christ or something. And then the jumper, they say, belonged to somebody like Fred West or whoever, and no one will even open the bag, let alone touch it or put it on. And of course, neither of these things is true, but we invest physical artifacts with tremendous power, and I think there's something quite ancient in that within us. Well, my favorite physical artifact story is I scratched the Imagine piano. Can't remember if I've shared that one ever, but
you did what?
Well, I'm obviously a massive John Lennon fan and a Bob Dylan fan, and this is the first dual biography of these two people.
Yeah.
And when Louise and Andy from Sleeper were doing some recording in London, I was spending some time in Los Angeles, and I would come back periodically and stay in their house actually. And they were working in George Michael's studio, and he bought the Imagine piano. So to save it for posterity, 1.4 million it cost, and it would have gone to America. And it's a brown Steinway upright piano. It's not the white one in the video, and it's the one that the whole album was recorded on. Some great piano tracks on that record. And it was being stored at George Michael's studio, and he was sampling it every key, and then it was going to go off to some museum. It's now in a museum in Liverpool. And Andy was like, "We got to go and have a look at this piano. George isn't in today," so we jumped in a taxi, and I got in those days you would buy a disposable camera. Yeah. So I grabbed a disposable camera, and we like flash, picture, loads of pictures of this piano, and I was posing by it, and I had on basically a denim jacket with a metal button. And the very last picture, we all gathered around it, and I hugged it, and I went, "This is the most amazing day of my life." And I sort of stroked it, or tried to just like pet it across the top lid of the piano, and about an elbow length in, I put a massive scratch with a metal button of my jacket right across the top of the piano. And
how did you square that away with George?
Well, I said to the engineer who was helping Lou and Andy record their stuff, I was like, "What do we do?" I said, "I just got to tell him. Just got to tell him what I've done." And he's like, "No, I'll be so stoned, he won't even know." And the piano does have quite a lot of marks on it. It's got like cigarette marks from when John Lennon would leave cigarettes. Yeah, as people used to do, cigarettes burning, and they'd burn out on the side of the piano, presumably while I was working out some tune. And so we just left it there. It's still there. If you go and see it, it's under a glass case today, so no other idiot can touch it. But it's about an elbow length in, right hand side of the piano as you look at it on the lid.
I love that.
Scratch. It's about that long, right across the top of the piano lid.
You really need that on the plaque, don't you?
Yeah. Well, now George,
marks by.
Now George is sadly. Yeah, now George has sadly passed away. I can tell the story. I kept quite well. I told a few students as an anecdote, but
that's brilliant. Yeah, is that the only other famous person's piano that you've played with, or is it?
I think that's pretty much. I met Brian Wilson a couple of times. That was quite entertaining. The first time I met Brian Wilson was in Los Angeles in a club, and we were working in I was DJing in this little club when I was living in LA, and it was a sort of British music club. And he came in. The owners knew him and brought him in just for some. I think there was another English band were there as well. They'd been playing in the town, so I was living there at the time, and they were playing. So all the British bands would come down. Rodney Bingenheimer, if you know that character, he'd come down. So I think maybe Rodney brought down Brian Wilson. That's right, because he wanted to meet the English band that were in town that day, which was Rialto. And so I met Rialto, and then we met Brian, and Brian had the softest handshake of anybody I'd ever met, but it was like it was just an incredible meeting. And then lo and behold, 3 years later, I'm working in Brighton in what is now BIM University, where I teach, and I'm getting phone calls at my desk from a particular student who I know is a bit of a toker. He's like calling me, going, "Yeah, Brian Wilson's in the laundrette opposite your office." I'm like, "Dude, he's really not. I think you need to slow down a little bit." And they call me back. "Look, I'm sure that's Brian Wilson." Our office was not in a glamorous, it was a back street in Brighton, in Kemp Town. "I'm sure that's Brian." I'm like, "Mate, honestly, just take it easy. I think you're hallucinating." So anyway, eventually, after the third phone call, I popped down from the office to have a look. And sure enough, there's Brian Wilson doing his tour smalls in the laundrette on at the top of St James Street in Kemp Town. So I popped in and I said, Brian, hi, you won't remember me, but we met in Los Angeles 3 years ago. And he shook my hand again and he said, I remember you. And I said, no, honestly, Brian, you don't remember me. It was a club. It was a very brief meeting, you know. And he's insisting, no, I remember you. I remember you. And then his manager comes up, puts his hand across my shoulder and goes, you need to leave, sir. And I'm going, no, I have met him. And Brian's going, yeah, I remember this guy. And I'm going to Brian, no, you don't remember me, Brian, but we did meet before.
Oh,
so
bless.
I was suddenly in this moment in a laundrette in a back street in Kemp Town, trying to convince Brian Wilson that no, he doesn't remember me, whilst also trying to convince his manager that yes, I have actually met him, but no, he doesn't remember me.
That's the best story ever.
And then he went on his merry way with a little bag of fresh tour smalls, and I went back to the office.
Very nice indeed. Very nice indeed. The only famous person's piano that I have played was Tori Amos.
Oh, that's pretty cool. She's very picky about her pianos. Yeah,
and she's very picky about her pianos. But I was doing sound for her at one of the first gigs she did in the UK, and she was drenched as a rat, so she needed she needed to get changed. And she said, "Do you mind just sound checking my piano?"
Oh wow, that's a great honor, because
so that was very
I know
nice.
She's very, very careful about keyboards. She's very that's she must have,
and
had
rightly
great
so, because they're quite expensive.
Yes, she must have had great trust in you.
Or she was stupid, but it was it was fine. It was fine. And what was really funny about it, my friend, was that it was quite a small club, and I was sat there just tonking away, and people started coming in. Wow. Got a little ripple of applause from the audience, which was hilarious. So there's a little bit of jazz for you.
Fantastic.
Oh, lovely story. Listen, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. You need to get off. I need to get off. We've all busy things.
Yeah, I've got
plug of the book.
I was going to say I've got a couple of playlists on Spotify. The first is the sort of guitar songs that I love that influenced me, including I think some of that early Devo stuff we were talking about, and then Public Place. And the second playlist is songs that I write about in this, the sort of story of Bob Dylan and John Lennon's relationship. And I'm not a Marxist. It just looks at their politics, and I'm not religious, but it looks at their different belief systems really. And so there's two, if anybody is interested in listening to some tunes, there's every song mentioned in the book, and there's some quite obscure Dylan stuff in there, and some interesting Lennon stuff, like when he wrote songs taking the piss out of Bob Dylan, who's a massive hero to him, and then he wrote some parody Dylan songs that eventually came out. They're all in that playlist. And so if anybody does want to hear some tunes, that's the place to go if you look for Jon Stewart on Spotify.
Yeah, you've got a little link tree, haven't you? And then people can.
Yeah, if you go to John Sleeper on the link tree, there's links to the Spotify there.
Go have a listen. There's a book. So Christmas is coming up. What can I say? That's a great.
It's 20 quid for an academic book. It's 20 quid, which is really cheap. Cambridge University Press, so it's a proper publisher, and it's hardback. So it's great. It's the perfect present for the Dylan or Beatles fan.
Of course it is. There's that's no money at all.
20 quid for a hardback, like really rigorous publisher. I could leave you with a good Robbie Williams anecdote if you want one.
Go for it.
So when I was in LA, I got to play on a K.D. Lang album, which was a great privilege, and we were in a very posh studio, and
great voice.
All the staff were cleaning up like mad, and I'm like, "What are you doing?" Like, Robbie Williams is coming in later today, and they're like washing all the cups and everything and hoovering. And I'm like, Robbie Williams, I've met Robbie Williams. I'm like, yeah, Robbie Williams is coming in, and so everyone's clear, all the like polishing all the surfaces, and Robbie Williams is coming in. And I was like, blimey, it's not like, okay, Robbie Williams, but there's a very quiet knock at the door while they're all busy cleaning up, and I opened the door of the studio just off Sunset, and it's Robin Williams. I've misheard. It's Robin Williams, and he stood there like, "Hello." He's the nicest man that I ever met. He's just a genuinely nice. I was like, Robin Williams, right? Okay.
That is actually something else, isn't it?
Took him in, sat him down, made him a cup of tea, and I can confirm that Robin Williams was a genuinely nice bloke who would chat to anybody who and give them the time of day. And yeah, what a comedy hero that guy was. It was unbelievable.
Sad loss.
Yeah.
Useless at singing angels, though.
Yeah.
John, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you today. Thanks so much for doing this.
Anytime.
We'll keep in touch. Okay,
yes, please.
Thanks. Do subscribe to this so that you know what's going on next time. There's a video. More music from other people coming soon. But until now, it's been Jon Stewart, wonderful guest today. Bye for now.